Acts chapter 2, reading verse 22 through 23 from a sermon that Peter was giving. You that are Israelites, listen to what I have to say. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God with deeds of power, wonders, and signs that God did through him among you, as you yourselves know. This man, handed over to you according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of those outside the law. But God raised him up, having freed him from death, because it was impossible for him to be held in its power. Back a long time ago, when television shows were broadcast in black and white, there was a show that I used to enjoy where the actor Raymond Burr starred as the lawyer, Perry Mason. Now, as the TV audience, we knew that his clients were innocent, and Perry Mason knew that his clients were innocent. But the drama of the show came when he went to court and had to square off against the Los Angeles County District Attorney, who had a very interesting name, Hamilton Burger. Yes, we could have called him Hamburger because of the way Perry Mason chewed him up every week. And what at first appeared to be an airtight case would simply crumble under Perry's withering cross-examination. Sometimes the climax of the show would be reached when some tearful witness would point across the courtroom and sob, "I saw the man putting the murder weapon into the trash can. It was the dentist." And there would be a great collective gasp in the courtyard, in the courtroom. And that would quickly wrap up the episode for another week. It made for dramatic television. An eyewitness account makes for dramatic courtroom testimony. But in real life, even though it is given under oath, and even though it is given with the heartfelt belief that it is accurate, the testimony is often distorted. The longer the time between the incident and the testimony, the more likely it will be that our minds will distort and massage the memories. People who start off kind of uncertain as to what they saw, saying, "Oh, wow, it all happened so fast," will find that in a couple of months, they honestly feel confident and certain of themselves, particularly as they play the scene over and over and over again in their minds, and little details are readjusted to make it all seem right in their own minds based upon their own life experiences. Perhaps as a child, they were frightened by somebody who had a mean dog. And in this particular instance, one of the characters has a dog. Oh yeah, we know who the guilty guy is. That's the way our minds work and adjust things. Well, in the past 3 years, over 300 convictions have been overturned by using modern forensic DNA techniques. In more than 70% of those cases, eyewitness identification had contributed to the conviction. In other words, in more than 70% of those cases, eyewitness identification had been wrong or distorted. Now, when we turn to the Gospels, we find we have 4 accounts of Easter morning. They're all different. And so we know the Gospel writers didn't copy off each other or get together to collaborate on the story. In one Gospel account, it was just Mary Magdalene at the tomb. In another, she was accompanied by the other Mary, the mother of James. In a different Gospel account, we find a woman named Salome had joined them, making it a group of 3. In one case, an earthquake moved the stone. In another, it was an angel inside the tomb that moved the stone. Once in the tomb, was it one angel or were there 2? In one account, 2 of the disciples ran to the tomb to see it for themselves. But rather than focusing on these little discrepancies, I am impressed with how much of the story is essentially the same. Early on Sunday morning, women went to the tomb to anoint the body of their friend with spices. They found the tomb open and empty, and the women were told that Jesus has risen from the dead. Go, tell his disciples. The women were terrified. They fled. They told the disciples. So, in the 4 Gospels, we have 4 eyewitness accounts that were substantially the same. Here comes the interesting part. When Paul was writing about the resurrection in 1 Corinthians, he wrote that Jesus appeared to Cephas, Peter that is, and the 12. And then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters, most of whom are still alive, though some have died, he writes. The implication was that if someone didn't believe in Jesus' resurrection, then there were plenty of people around that could testify to the reality of the event. But what is interesting is that Paul never mentions the women who were the first eyewitnesses to the events of that Easter Sunday morning. Of course, Paul lived in an age when the testimony of a woman was automatically suspect and would not be accepted in court. But how sad that Paul would lift up the witness of Peter over the women who were there at the very beginning. Elsewhere, Paul celebrates the women who were serving as deacons and serving as church leaders and as co-workers in the gospel. So perhaps it could also be argued that Paul knew the people he was writing to. He knew the Corinthian people, and therefore he chose to write in such a way as to not have his argument dismissed out of hand because of their biases and their limitations. On Thursday night, Jesus and his disciples shared the Last Supper. Later that night, he was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. After a trial before Pilate, he was crucified by professionals and died around 3 on Friday afternoon. Before releasing the body to Joseph of Arimathea, Pilate checked to be certain that Jesus was really dead. And just to make sure, a soldier ran a spear through his side. Racing against the sundown that would mark the start of the Sabbath, Jesus' body was wrapped in a cloth with spices and placed in a new tomb by Joseph of Arimathea. At sunrise on Sunday, the women went to anoint his body and found the tomb empty. Mary of Magdala claimed to have seen the risen Lord and to have spoken with him. That afternoon, Cleopas and another follower were walking to the town of Emmaus. A stranger joined them and asked why they looked so sad. They told him about the crucifixion of Jesus, who they had hoped was God's Messiah. The stranger then explained how the prophecies of the Old Testament were all fulfilled in Jesus, and that even his crucifixion and his death were a part of God's plan. Arriving in Emmaus, they sat down to have dinner together, and as Jesus broke the bread, they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. Miles away in Jerusalem, the disciples had gathered behind locked doors for fear that they might be arrested, when suddenly Jesus appeared there with them. He showed them his wounds. He ate with them and thoroughly convinced them that he had, in fact, risen from the dead in a transformed and glorified state. By this, I don't mean that he was merely alive again, because what would that mean? It means he would be weak and wounded and pierced and staggering. No, it wasn't like that at all. He was alive in a different way, a way that transcended our mortal experience. He could eat and drink and be recognized, but he could appear and disappear and pass through locked doors. Had the capability to do things that clearly surpassed our human abilities. Paul wrote to the Corinthians, listen, I'll tell you a mystery. Here's something you're not going to understand it, but I'm going to tell you anyway. We will not all die, but we will all be changed. This perishable body must put on imperishability. This mortal body must put on immortality. Jesus was the first to be transformed by God in a manner that Paul claims will be common to us, common to all believers, and something we can look forward to in the future. Jesus' resurrection brought a brand new understanding of death. Death was not just decomposition or annihilation or a dark, shadowy underworld of Sheol. Rather, Jesus said, in my Father's house are many rooms, and I'm going to prepare a place for each of you. Rather than darkness, solitude, Jesus spoke of a community of believers enveloped by God's love. Jesus' resurrection also brought a new perspective and understanding of life. Life is more than just 60 or 70 or 90 years of toil and hardship and pain, or a vale of tears, as it used to be called. Is there a purpose for our lives? Hymn writer Isaac Watts once wrote a little poem he entitled Insignificant Existence, which goes like this. There are a number of us who creep into the world to eat and sleep and know no reason why we are born, but only to consume the corn, devour the cattle, the fowl and fish, and leave behind an empty dish. Is that all there is to our existence? Is that all there is to life? Life should be lived in partnership with God's plans and purposes and power. where the Spirit of God dwelling within us becomes a guiding and a shaping force in our lives as we strive to follow the examples and teachings of Jesus. Jesus said, love your enemies, turn the other cheek, go the extra mile, take the last seat at the banquet table, bless those who curse you, forgive that you may be forgiven. Yes, it's asking a lot to say, imitate the example of Jesus. It takes God's indwelling power to be transformed into the people that God wants us to be. The making of a saint is a task that will take an entire lifetime. Maxie Dunham wrote of leading a day-long workshop on prayer at a Christian conference, and attending his workshop were a group of 6 women who had all come from the same church, and they were a good-natured and rowdy group that brought a lot of life and laughter to the event. And a couple of weeks after the conference, one of the women wrote him a note saying, I thought you would be interested in our group of 6, obviously enjoying the Lord's and each other's company. One is an alcoholic, but given the simple medicine of love, last drank in November 1973. One whose husband left her with 2 boys, and while he's off living with his fancy lady, somehow she is making it alone by the power of Christ. One has just won a battle over cancer. One has just gone through the anguish of placing her mother in a nursing home. One's husband just had an affair. But now both women are in the prayer group, praying hand in hand each week. One was on the verge of a nervous breakdown before the conference, and now is praising God. And she concluded her note by writing, how is that to prove that while life grinds on, we find joy, we find peace in the Lord. And then she added a humorous P.S., bet you wonder which is which, but that's a secret. So it is, Easter 2023. The question we must each ask ourselves is, do I possess a joyous, transforming faith, or am I here simply out of a sense of duty to a stone-cold formula of belief that I have given mental agreement to, but which leaves my day-to-day living untouched and untransformed? Easter gives us a brand new understanding of death and what lies beyond. It also gives a brand new understanding of life and what is possible with God's help. Amen.